Imagine for a moment a postman walking his route on your street. But it's not long before you notice that I am not your regular postman, delivering the mail you might normally expect. You see, I deliver stories, tales of the grim and mysterious in particular. Ghosts and shadows haunt these pages, some inspired by true stories, others entirely from my own mind. And if you decide you're brave enough to see what I've delivered today, well, I warned you.
Rising from the Darkness. In 2005, a French diver named Henri Astor was diving off the coast of Thailand with an anonymous companion. It was mostly an uneventful dive, as the weather had been mild all day, and all in all, it was a perfect day to conduct this specific type of dive. Henry and his friend were going to enter a shark cage that day. The boat was taken out over some of the Pacific Ocean's deeper waters, where the clear blue color of the shallows quickly faded into a navy darkness. It was an area where observing all manner of sea life was a very real possibility, and so the boat stopped, and the cage was lowered so the divers could make their way inside. Upon entering, all sound was smothered by the deep blue waters, except for the sounds of the divers' own breathing. Once Henry got his bearings, they began to observe the great expanse all around them. Oddly, there was very little signs of life that day, except for the occasional school of fish, which would gradually come more into view for a few minutes, then disappear into the dark blue abyss. Henry let out a sigh into the mask, wondering if perhaps the day might be a wash. But when he looked down into the deep, he spotted something. At first, it looked as if it might be a trick of the sunlight meeting the place in the deep where the sunlight dies. But then it became more apparent that the dark shadow that had come from below was slowly getting closer to them. Henry strained his eyes in his slightly fogged mask to make sure that what he was looking at was real. But when his companion joined him staring at the thing, he knew. They found themselves watching as a massive shape, which moved as if it were alive, rose from the darkness very slowly, coming nearer and nearer. Henry perceived that what they were witnessing looked as though it was a gigantic, previously unknown species of jellyfish, but he couldn't tell for sure. It was dark in color and impossibly large from what he knew about jellyfish. The top seemed to be a mix of brown and perhaps a deep purple, and the edges of the thing were slowly pulsating, perhaps to propel the creature upward. From end to end, it might have been 100 foot, but Henry could not possibly know exactly how large from where they were. They were still staring in awe at the beast from the depths when suddenly another shoal of fish came through. Without warning, the fish's bodies suddenly tremored and froze, as if they had been hit by an invisible bolt of lightning. As the fish's bodies slowly sank out of sight, so did the gargantuan sea creature. Henry was about to go back up to the boat to explain what they had just seen, when curiosity seemed to get the better of his friend, who began exiting the shark cage. Henry at first tried to convince him to accompany himself back to the surface, but his companion paid him no attention and began swimming down toward the darkness, surely to try and get a better look at what they had just seen. He followed the same path that the creature had traveled moments ago, and Henry watched as his fellow diver disappeared from sight into the mysterious darkness below. Henry never saw his companion again, nor did he ever again see the giant jellyfish-like entity, although he continued to visit that diving spot several times more over the years to solve the mystery of what happened that day. The window. My grandma was always having problems with her neighbor across the street. They lived out in the country, in a secluded area where there was just about a handful of houses, around a few hundred yards away from each other. Most of the families got along just fine, except for one particular person. The house across from my grandma's. It was occupied by a single, middle-aged woman. I can't remember exactly what her name was, so for this story, we'll call her Charlotte. My grandma used to tell my dad to stay away from Charlotte because not only was she just a very unpleasant person, but there was a rumor she was a seasoned practitioner of witchcraft as well. Charlotte apparently kept to herself most of the time, but according to my grandma, God help you if you happen to be out and about at the same time she was. Anyway, there was one particular week that my grandma had bumped into Charlotte a couple of times for some very unpleasant interactions, and they had not ended very well. This led to something very strange happening to my grandma later that week. My grandma was home alone one evening, and she was very tired from taking care of the house and the animals out back all day, so she decided to lay down in the living room for a nap on the couch. The living room in their house wasn't anything special and was pretty small, but it did have a large front window that looked out onto the yard by the driveway. My grandma got nested under a blanket on the couch and closed her eyes. The afternoon sun washed over her through the window, and it was so warm and cozy that she fell asleep pretty quickly. After a while, though, she started having a really strange dream. She dreamed that she was right where she was, asleep on the living room couch. The sun was coming in through the window just as it had been in real life when she fell asleep. She said that she could even see herself sleeping in the third person, kind of. But the dream didn't stay that way. There was a shadow which began to intrude on the sunlight from the window, starting from one end and making its way toward the other. It was the obvious shadow of a person outside, just on the other side of the glass, walking by slowly. My grandma looked up to see who the visitor was in the dream, only for her to see Charlotte, her aging face twisted with rage, staring in at my grandma through the glass. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then, without warning, Charlotte raised a hand above her head. With a furious banshee-like shriek, she suddenly slammed her hand against the window, and the glass shattered, spilling all over the living room floor. My grandma woke up in a panic, sweating and hyperventilating. It was the most terrifying dream she could remember having. She was going to get up and get a glass of water to calm her nerves. But when she looked down at the living room floor, she gasped. The big window across from her was totally shattered, and the living room floor was covered in broken glass. My grandma jumped up and made her way as quickly as possible to the front door and searched all around for Charlotte, in case it wasn't a dream after all. But she was nowhere to be seen. Then she and some others worked up the nerve to go to Charlotte's house and see if it really was her that broke the window. But they soon found out that was not possible. Charlotte had passed away in her house earlier that day. A house on a haunted hill. This next story is a bit different from the others in that it can't be confirmed to be a true paranormal encounter, but I decided to include it here because the urban legend fascinates me, and I didn't know what other sort of video in which I could include it. So enjoy. My grandparents' house is located on top of a hill in the woods, which houses an abandoned coal mine. They caved the entrance to the mine in decades ago, but if you go down in the woods, you can still see the remains of an old mine cart and the rails that the cart rode on sticking out of the dirt in the hill. But the old well down there is the creepiest part. It's an old brick well which goes at least 50 feet down. My grandpa said there used to be a cabin down there before the dam broke and swept it away. He used to tell us that it's because of that old cabin that the woods around his house were haunted. And the story he used to tell me and my brother when we would spend the night still gives me goosebumps to this day. He said that the miners actually lived down there when they were working that mine. There were 3 of them that he knew of, and they all stayed together in that cabin. They got their water from that well, and hunted for their food for the most part. There were some railroad tracks down there, which still exist to this day, about a half-mile from the cabin, which were in regular use even back then. According to the story, one night after the 3 men had eaten their dinner, one of the men got pretty drunk on whiskey or something. He decided to go for a walk through the woods after dark. The other 2 stayed behind to get ready for bed, although they were a tad concerned about their intoxicated partner. At some point, a train did pass in the night, and it woke the men just like usual. One of them looked at the time, and it was past midnight. He then looked around the cabin and saw that the 3rd man was still not back from his walk. He supposed that he must have passed out somewhere in the woods. After cursing under his breath, he decided to go out and look for him. The other man in the cabin was sleeping soundly for probably about a half hour, when suddenly he woke to a strange sound. He roused himself, rubbing his tired eyes, and he listened closely. His hair stood on end when he realized what the sound was. It was the sound of a man screaming for help. He leapt out of bed and, without even putting his boots on, ran out of the cabin door into the darkness. The cicadas were screeching out into the empty night air as he listened again for the screams. He called out to the voice, and it soon responded. The man then took off running through the shadowy wood, screaming for his friends. What he came upon eventually was his roommate who had left earlier to look for the first man, staring down the railroad tracks in horror. He had indeed found his companion. What they had guessed had happened was that in a drunken stupor, he tried to walk across the railroad tracks, then tripped and fell, passing out across the tracks. The train had not even jostled as it mutilated the young miner's body. The story doesn't end there, though. According to my grandpa, if you go down in those woods and spend the night, and if you stay awake till after midnight, right around that time you will start to hear the sounds of somebody running through the woods. And soon after you will hear the screams of 2 men echoing through the darkness. I tried it once, about 7 years ago. Me and some friends and my dog decided to give it a shot to see if we could hear anything. And unfortunately, we didn't hear any screams or footsteps. But something strange did happen. Just as we were about to go to sleep, my dog, who is normally very docile and friendly, suddenly stood up, very alert, and began barking into the distance. I tried to calm him down, and he did stop barking, but he didn't stop staring into the woods while letting out a low growl. The moon was out, and we couldn't see anything out there except the shadows of the scraggly trees which swayed gently in the night breeze. We didn't hear anything that might be setting him off either, but something had made him clearly uneasy and on edge in a way I'd never seen him before. Was it the ghosts of the miners? I don't know enough to say. Was it just coincidence? Probably, but still, one has to wonder.